Thank you very much for coming on a hot night, but on a really important topic at a time when it seems that almost every day the news gets grimmer in Pakistan. It feels to me that there's really a battle for the very soul of the country going on at the moment. Farzana Shaikh, who's with us on the platform from Chatham House, has written a wonderful new book called Making Sense of Pakistan, which goes really right back to the very roots of Pakistan's identity. Will be for sale afterwards, I should say. It's her book, but for vulgar commercial reasons, I bought a handful of my own, Butcher and Bolt, the history of foreign engagement in Afghanistan, which does cover the frontier in a large degree, because really the whole history of the region depends on what happened on that frontier. And the war that's going on now is being fought in exactly the same place the British were fighting in the 19th century, something I'm sure we might talk about in a minute. Also on the platform, Bronwyn Maddox, chief foreign commentator of The Times. Her book, In Defence of America, still very much in the bookshops. Victoria Schofield, who's written a book called Afghan Frontier, and another one, Kashmir in Conflict, both very relevant, coming out in the autumn. And just to complete the vulgar commercial bit of the evening, Owen Bennett-Jones, a BBC colleague of mine, his really definitive guide to modern Afghanistan, Eye of the Storm, is coming out in a reprinted edition in the autumn. And as anyone who listens to the radio or watches television will know, he has had really good access to not only lowland Pakistan, but the frontier in recent weeks, and so can bring us absolutely up to date. I just want to go along the panel very quickly. First, you know, I started off with this very gloomy war for the end of the world, battle for the soul of the country, and I must say I feel a bit gloomy about Pakistan. Bronwyn, are you optimistic?
I am optimistic. It'd be hard to capture it in a book title. Pakistan, the Happy Land, doesn't quite sound right at the moment. Pakistan, not quite as bad as it seems, is probably more where I'd put myself. But if you think of the things it has got going for it, a government democratically elected without too much ballot rigging, compared to what we saw on Sunday, for example, an army which is at the moment trying to detach itself from politics and from undermining its democratic neighbour to the east. A lot of very talkative lawyers, fantastic media, particularly in the television. This is not a failed state. This is a state with an immense number of problems, but it is not a failed state. And when I go there, the thing that always strikes me is how commercial life does keep going in a very commercial way. And, for example, Pakistan didn't cut itself off in the way India did, in a kind of fantasy of isolationism. It kept going, and I tend to think that in a lot of these things, every time Pakistan gets to the brink, it does keep going.
Victoria, I mean, you were a close personal friend of Benazir's. You must mourn the loss, and we never saw what opportunities she might bring this time round in government, but her husband's in power. How optimistic are you?
Well, again, I think, you know, if one sits on a panel and promotes doom and gloom, it's too much almost. One has to remain optimistic. I actually think, and I echo what Bronwyn says in terms of the various things that Pakistan has going for it, and if you think that we never saw how Benazir could have come into office third time round, she was older, wiser, certainly prepared to acknowledge previous errors. And in a way, it's remarkable that Pakistan is as it is now, given that the most sort of effective charismatic leadership was cut, you know, out sort of before they had the election. But nonetheless, we have, as Bronwyn says, a democratically elected government. I am firmly in favour of keeping the civilian elected government process going and not throwing in the towel every time it's not performing quite adequately and then thinking, let the military come in, because when that happens, you inevitably have a hiatus in the institutions.
Well, it's one of those
back to square one.
It's one of those truisms about Pakistan. It's one of those countries that's had both an unstable dictatorship and unstable democracy, and about the same half of each since partition. Owen, you've been up to the frontier, you've seen the destruction, 2.5 million displaced people. It's hard to be optimistic.
Well, I agree. I mean, the fight is on. It's a new thing, and it's very bitter. When I last left it, I think the army had killed, they said, over 1,000 militants. You might expect 2,000 or 3,000 wounded, 50 wounded. So it's a very brutal battle. They're trying to eliminate the Taliban, and it, in my view, will go on for years. And I'm not sure that the state and the people will actually be able to sustain it in terms of continuing this fight for as long as it will need to be done. So I think it's a new thing for those who've seen all the beheadings, videos, and the child suicide bombers and all this revolting things that are going on. It's encouraging that the fight has been joined, but whether it can be sustained, I think, is difficult.
Well, now, Farzana, you talk in your book about, you say the dilemma between Islam and nationalism in Pakistan is the single greatest source of ideological uncertainty in the country. You also, in this book, really challenge the sort of generally held view that Pakistan was, inverted commas, was invented to take India's Muslims. And this is what people know about the history of Pakistan. And you say, well, hang on a minute, it wasn't really quite that simple going right back to 1947. There is a complex role of Islam and nationalism in the country. Well, the title of your book is Making Sense of Pakistan. I mean, does it make sense? Does it have a reason to exist?
Well, whether it makes sense is really for my readers to say, isn't it? Just on the question of whether or not one is optimistic, I should say, just coming into this debate, that I would like to be optimistic about Pakistan, but I'm not. And the reason why I'm not is because although, as Frontline says, it has a whole lot going for it, I think ideological confusion is so deeply embedded in this state that its potential to continue to breed dangerous consequences will remain. And I think, at this point, I'm certainly not prepared to predict a happy outcome. And we can go into the details later.
I mean, at the end of your book, you're quite, I wouldn't say optimistic, but idealistic at least. You say, well, if there is a sort of democratic pluralism which understands the Indian roots of this civilization and takes on board all the other different sorts of Islam, then we can move forward. But I mean, are these real issues on the streets in a country that's literally fighting for its life against the Taliban?
I think that's coming, and as I said, it's a very big if, but I think if Pakistan is going to extricate itself from its current predicament, it has to return to its roots, it has to return to the region, it has to return to that great tradition of what I would call Indian Islam, which made its peace with diversity, which taught us all how to accommodate pluralism. And I think that's really the only way forward for Pakistan, much more than any apparent change in political dispensation from military to civilian regimes.
So how to handle the Deobandis, then, is the big challenge, really? Is it how to take them on? How to take on this long strand of South Asian Islam, which is now popped out and flowered with the Taliban, the Pakistani Taliban emerging in the last couple of years?
Well, I think the difficulty in Pakistan is really one of the state having become too deeply embedded and too deeply tied with Islam. I mean, really what I think we need in Pakistan is a new constitutional settlement, a neutral constitutional settlement that will loosen the nexus between the state and Islam, not deepen it. And at the moment, what we're seeing, seems to me are not very great grounds for optimism. I mean, we've seen just in the last couple of months the state moving in to sponsor Sufi councils, parties deciding that perhaps it would be best to give a mandate to so-called moderate ulama to handle the Taliban threat. I mean, all of this, it seems to me, is digging a hole that really we need to get out of. As I said, I really think the time now has come in Pakistan for us to step away from Islam, for the state to return to some kind of neutral ground, no longer to ally itself with any one version of Islam as being either emblematic of Pakistan or the Pakistanis.
It's immensely optimistic to think that Pakistan can sort of return to some sort of secular constitutional settlement, and this conversation can go on outside Islam. I mean, particularly since, so take us back to over the last 20 or 30 years, since, well, General Zia really was the person who I thought sort of moved this ratchet of Islamicisation in only one direction, really, towards Sharia law.
Yes, well, I mean, what Zia did was, you know, step into what I would call a morass of uncertainty. This was his way to address the enduring and fundamental uncertainty that lay at the heart of the idea of Pakistan, an uncertainty that, you know, I have tried to argue in my book had very deep historical roots. And one of the points that you yourself raised was something that, you know, I've gone into. I mean, for example, it was never really very clear whether Pakistan was to be a point of destination for India's Muslims, or a consolidated center of Muslim power. I mean, right there was a great deal of contestation around the idea of the nation. And this was never really clarified. And Jinnah himself always remained deeply ambivalent about this. There was, of course, furthermore, no real consensus on Islam, or indeed which kind of Islam was to be was to reflect or be expressive of the state.
There wasn't an established church, as it were.
Indeed, well, there
European sense.
There isn't an established church anywhere in Islam. But I think, you know, what it really brings home to us is really the difficulty of trying to construct some kind of nation on the basis of religion. And I think really what we're seeing today, 60 years on, you know, are the consequences of that, because at the heart is this very vexed relationship between Islam and the nation state in Pakistan.
But do these arguments have a live political reality? Because one does hear increasingly from Pakistani intelligentsia the sense of being part of the Indian subcontinent, having a shared history. It's something that, for me, is fairly new. You know, 15 years ago, people talked about Pakistan as this great, strong nation, and as separate to India. But there now seems to be more of a growing sense of that maybe we've lost something in losing the roots of this nation. I mean, is that something that can be the kind of thought that can be built on in your rather optimistic move towards or idealistic move towards a new constitutional settlement?
Well, there are certainly recognizable strains in that direction. The question is, you know, whether and if they can assume some kind of dominant voice. And at the moment, I'm afraid they don't. I mean, they are very much a minority voice. But there is a feeling in Pakistan, certainly within you know, sections of the legal fraternity, within sections of the so-called liberal press, human rights activists, that, you know, there is this need for Pakistan to return again to its subcontinental roots, as it were. That the great damage done to Pakistan was because it became too Arabized, and in fact there is today you know, an attempt, certainly within some sections of society, to try and dilute and reduce the influence of so-called Arabized Islam in favor of what might be called Indian Islam, because Arabized Islam is seen as alien.
And Indian Islam of a particular sort of Sufi variety.
Of a particular Sufi variety, a particularly accommodative or pluralist version of Islam.
But that's not the conversation outside Islam that you're hoping will be had. I mean, you have a view that there might be some sort of new constitutional settlement outside Islam itself. Strikes me as being impossible.
Well, there are two. I think at the moment it's going to be a tall order. I think it's going to be very hard. I think everything at the moment is framed and couched very much in the language of Islam. We have a great deal of ground to make up, but I don't think that one can avoid having an open debate now about, I mean, it's clearly urgent to open up the debate about what kind of state Pakistan is going to become. And for this, I think we need a fresh debate precisely on the fundamental question of whether or not the state should still remain so deeply linked to Islam, such as we've had since 1947.
Victoria, I mean, how does this strike you? This new constitutional settlement, is it possible?
Well, I mean, I think it's actually very optimistic to think that you can unscramble a society and have them debate again about what their country is going to be shaped like, in a way. I feel that what we're lacking is revising and reminding ourselves why Pakistan came into being in the first place, and it essentially was for this political freedom which the Muslims of the subcontinent felt they weren't going to get in a Hindu majority subcontinent. And if we take out the fact that the countries went to war immediately, it possibly could have worked, because if you hadn't have had a bone of contention in terms of Kashmir, the idea was, and especially it explains why you had East Pakistan and West Pakistan. I mean, it was a nonsense to think you'd have two wings of a country if you'd ever envisaged sealed borders.
Yeah, where only 4% of the people spoke the national language.
Exactly, but the idea was, and certainly when the British finally agreed to it, because they just couldn't get the Hindu and the Congress Party and the Muslim League to agree, that they still felt there'll be a channel of communication. It came as a huge surprise that the borders were in fact sealed, and they might not have been sealed if you hadn't have had Kashmir. But I think, Farzana, your point about the Islamic sort of identity is very valid, and it's very important, but really it was for this political freedom. And the reason that Jinnah was able to make a case was by saying the Muslims are a nation by any definition. But he himself was muddled, and we've got to remember that had there been better safeguards, he would have been prepared to accept a federation, you know, along the lines of the cabinet mission plan. But it was just they couldn't work out this power sharing, and so they went for this sort of optimum solution of Pakistan states, sovereign states. Islam was introduced really to try and give the sort of the cohesion, and every so often the Islamic cards played, and I think when General Zia played it, he did it very evidently to give some kind of constituency away from the populist politics of Bhutto.
Well, if I could just come in there, I mean, obviously, there has been a great deal made of this question, that is to say, Pakistan as being the outcome of demands for the political and economic freedoms for Muslims, and in fact, people have gone so far as to argue that really religious ideology had nothing to do with Pakistan, and that it was really driven by the need to secure the economic and political interests, particularly of a Muslim service class who felt that they would be disadvantaged under Hindu majority rule. Now, be that as it may, when you actually look at the debates in the late 19th and early 20th century, it is clear that the idea of a Muslim homeland was that, but it was also a great deal more. I mean, someone like Iqbal, for example, was making a big case, not so much that Muslims were a nation, but that Islam in India needed a safe haven. And Iqbal, as many of you who will know Pakistan, is of course one of the presiding saints of Pakistan today, venerated and held in high esteem and seen very much as the country's leading ideologue. So there was always this tension in Pakistan between those who stood for the view that it was basically an expression of the economic and political interests of the Muslims of India, and those who felt that it was precisely to provide some kind of safe haven for Islam. And this contradiction has never, and this uncertainty has never really been resolved, with the result that Pakistan came to represent many things to many people, and in fact emerged as the heir of very, very contradictory and mutually exclusive expectations.
Do you think that's led to the problems that we're in now? I mean, is there some sense that the violence that we're now in can be rooted back at this sense of, you know, the ideological uncertainty over Islam and nationalism in the country.
Yes, very much so, and in fact that has been the thrust of my book. But I think
so is a route out of the violence to address this problem in the way that, in some really positive, you know, should the international community go steam in, get Saudi Arabia and some potential countries that some people in Pakistan might listen to, have a constitutional conference of the sort you describe, you know, and take on this issue in order to take on the fight, to take the poison out of the violence?
Well, it's obviously a very difficult question, and I suppose if pressed, I would probably say that, you know, what we're seeing today in Pakistan, just in terms of military action in the regions, in the Malakand area, in parts of the tribal areas, all of this has come much too late, so that, you know, we're really now reeling under the pressure and reeling from the consequences of measures that really should have been taken years ago, but which were not, for reasons that we can go into
Bronwyn,
later on.
It means we've now ended up, you're the optimist here, you know, with
I'll take that role for this evening.
What the Hillary Clinton, you know, the Secretary of State calls, you know, a mortal threat to the world, you know, the potential for nuclear weapons falling into the hands of people who will do more than blow up several dozen on the underground if they got their hands on them, and Pakistan really facing literally a fight for its life in the view of the US administration. I mean, how will all this go down in Washington, do you think?
Well, they're worried, and yes, Pakistan has nuclear weapons and it has extremists, so anyone can imagine the two being put together, so no one is relaxed about that. But I'm not sure that I can't say I disagree with everything you said. You put it so fluently and subtly, but nonetheless.
But there's a however coming.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to me that all the uncertainty you've described is bad for Pakistan, but particularly the uncertainty about Islam. Now, all right, some of that is clearly damaging. It's uncertainty about whether or not Islam or kind of a secular rule of law should be on top is damaging, and we've seen the results of that since February, when the government suddenly giving the Taliban this deal, giving part of the country its own Sharia rule of law. That is not helpful to the country. But some of what you described of kind of ambiguity about the soul of Pakistan seems to be has contributed to the very robust kind of muddle that the country has managed for 60 years. You take the way in a lot of Arab countries that it really matters whether you're Sunni or Shia. In Pakistan, that split has not mattered so much. Jinnah was Shia, Benazir was Shia. The Shias are very much the minority. People don't come at you with that particular divide, and Pakistan, it seems to me, has managed to make itself a place that has included a lot of different sorts of people without requiring them to define themselves the whole time. Other point I want to pick up on, though, is your point about the subcontinent and whether Pakistan might come to see itself more usefully as part of a subcontinent, and an affluent subcontinent at that. And I must say, I think that is the best future one can think of for Pakistan. I'm always struck by the helpful example of the rich neighbour next door. I think what it did to Northern Ireland, of seeing suddenly the Republic of Ireland suddenly turn into the Celtic tiger, even if that's now changed a bit. It did wonders for the peace process. I'm very struck talking to Pakistani journalists, one in particular I work with. He's in his mid-50s, and so people of his generation, for years, they're educated Pakistanis, they could say, well, look, my country's just gone a different way from India. And for the past 10, 15 years, that's really become impossible, as India's success has become recognizable to the whole world. And I think that is, on the whole, a really very helpful example, provided the two countries can wean themselves off this obsession with Kashmir.
Owen.
Well, I would agree with Farzana that the violence we see today does reflect ideological confusion and uncertainty as to what kind of Islam and what role it should have and so on. And I think there's a great lack of tolerance. I mean, sectarian violence has been going on for years, and tens of thousands of people have lost their lives. So there is a competition an ideological competition which is unresolved, and it's expressed violently. I think the idea of a secular constitution is utterly unrealistic, totally impossible. It's a westernized view. It's just never going to happen. Most Pakistanis don't want it. It would be foisted on them, and it won't work. So I just disagree with Farzana on this, and I think that the state is doing the right thing now. It is sponsoring a particular version of Islam, a more moderate, tolerant version of Islam. It's worked in Saudi Arabia. It's working elsewhere in the Middle East. It's the way to do it. And it is, I don't disagree that it'll lead to long-term sort of unresolved issues about where on earth other people who don't share those views fit in Pakistan, and there'll be difficulties ahead. But there's an urgent situation on now. You've got hundreds of thousands of troops fighting. And there's a war on, there's a civil war on. And Pakistan, the state, needs to back the right side.
How strong do you think that state is? I mean, you've got a president who emerged really out of nowhere, had never really been a politician before, and has done some extraordinarily things that have surprised Western diplomats. The things he said about Kashmir, the things he said about nuclear weapons were all well in advance of you know, and on a Western side of things that certainly the army would have said in their years in power. Does he really speak for the Pakistani state?
Well, I'm sure this is not what he wanted to do with his presidency. I mean, I don't
go to war on the frontier.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I think, as Victoria knows much better than I, he had ideas about India, and he had ideas about business and trade, and you know, he did have ideas which have all been totally overwhelmed by the situation he now finds himself in. You know, has he provided the leadership on this? Frankly, not really. I mean, the army's taken the lead on this. He was absent at the beginning of this campaign. I mean, it's an unbelievable thing that the country went to war and their president was abroad for a long, for weeks. So, I mean, it is a surprising situation in terms of the democratic lead that's being given to this. But he's there with American support, clearly. The Americans are delighted with what he's doing, and I imagine as long as he continues with this, the Americans will back him, and that has got to help his situation.
I mean, looking at the television pictures that come out at the moment, the sheer physical destruction. And I mean, Farah Durrani's here. She did an Al Jazeera film a year ago. There were towns in the northwest frontier, even then, that were totally flattened.
Well, I think
and
there's been happening less.
Is it happening less? Yeah. I was going to say. I mean, the sheer destruction to places where people live makes this quite a hard. You can't persuade people that you're fighting for hearts and minds when you destroy their house. No. I mean, what does it look like up there? What does the frontier feel like?
What you saw in Bajor, which is a precursor of this, so there was a sort of battle for a limited area, a tribal area, not 25 miles by 40 miles or something. It took 7 months. I mean, that's what we're into here. This is a major struggle. It's not going to be, you know, that's just a tiny little place. It took 7 months to clear it, and it was flattened. Hopeless in terms of any attempt to win over the people who live there. They can't live there. They've lost their homes. I mean, so the state basically won, and it lost. So that lesson, you know, everyone says Pakistan Army can't do this. I don't know. I mean, what I saw, I didn't go to Mingora, but what I've seen of the TV pictures in Mingora, it isn't flat. They've done it much more slowly, deliberately, and better, I think. And we'll see. I mean, there are 2.5 million people who've left their homes, and the crunch question is, can they go back home by the end of the year? Can they live their lives? Can they get going again? And I mean, I think that's an open issue. But in terms of the methods they're using to clear these areas, it seems to me they're much less destructive than they were.
But this is classic guerrilla territory. I mean, it is a region that the British fought every year in the frontier wars between 1849 and 1900.
Some of the places that the Pakistan Army are being ambushed are within metres the same place that the British.
They use the same gun positions that their grandfather said. I put my Jazile down on this rock, and at the end of the day, it was really good governance and employing enough people for tribal militias, for effectively the guides and new bits of the British Army that pacified it, and they ran out of steam. Although they were inspired by the same kind of Wahhabi Islam.
One issue coming up is the extent to which. I mean, yeah, there are different views, I'm sure there'll be different views here, on whether you just think that the situation is so serious that however undesirable the tribal structures are, and medieval and old-fashioned and hopeless and no education and no progress and no development, whether that is the only way to see off the radical Islamist challenge. I mean, I hold that view, that for the short term, the situation is so bad that you have to shore up these tribal leaders, let them organise their private armies, their lashkars, let them fight, arm them, let them do it, knowing that these people are regressive, undemocratic, hopelessly traditional, and in many ways unsatisfactory. But I can't see any other way of winning.
Well,
but do you think? I mean, do you think they will actually do the deal? I mean, that was what President Musharraf tried several times over, doing a deal on exactly those terms, with exactly those people.
They never.
It held about 2-3 months before they let the Taliban or whoever back in again. I mean, fine, you could accept the bargain, the ugly bargain you said, if you thought it would work.
I also think it's a repeat of what we did in Afghanistan. We shored up the warlords and the tribal lot, and we're now stuck with them. I'm afraid I don't quite...
It's not a great choice.
It's not a great, no, it's not a great choice, but I think some element of sort of open, more transparent society in the front is going to have to happen.
I just also want to say that, you know, it's important to understand that the role of the military who are fighting this war at the moment is still deeply ambivalent. We do not really know to what extent, and I think we really have to face up to this, because while we are being told that, you know, they are out there fighting a war, and this time it's going to be different, we are really far from certain whether or not there has been a fundamental shift in military thinking. We are far from certain whether the military have indeed decided to abandon their so-called strategic assets. We are indeed far from certain whether they have given up this damaging idea of the good Taliban and the bad Taliban. And really all of this again ties back to the point that I tried to make in my book, and that is that in a situation like Pakistan, where there is such intense and damaging contestation over Islam, the last thing we need now is to add a further layer of so-called religious governance, with the government or the state mandating a certain brand of Islam as somehow emblematic of the state. We need to draw back from this. The state must cease being partisan. What I meant by a new constitutional settlement was really the urgency of a neutral constitution that would...
But you can't win a guerrilla war with conventional forces. No one's ever done it. And so you need some other things, and it could be that bringing some people, some local tribal leaders on your side might be one way of doing it.
That may well be the case, but as we've just heard, you know, it hasn't really worked in Pakistan. And the reason why it hasn't worked, I would argue, is because there, you know, the whole system is driven by an attempt to gain control and gain a monopoly over the expression of Islam. What has become typical of Pakistan today, to my mind, is not so much gaining control of the state, but gaining control of Islam. And that, to my mind, has been one of the most damaging consequences.
I mean,
of this
there was suddenly a moment of optimism from the Pakistani establishment a couple of weeks ago when there was a Taliban bomb in a mosque, you'll remember, and the local tribal leaders took on the Taliban and got them out of town. And I must say, I had the same slight sort of gasp of breath that you might have done, which is, but these people taking on the Taliban, I mean, they're no friends of the West. You know, these are the Sufi shrine smashers, nor indeed the Pakistani government. They're the descendants of smugglers who've run routes across the northwest frontier for hundreds of years. You know, guns, drugs, mujahideen, you know, US aid, whatever it was. You know, whoever came to town, you know, buy my donkey. But they control that region absolutely for those reasons, because they ignore the frontier that was drawn. The unstable frontier, the most unstable frontier in the world, by the British in 1895.
Barely a frontier, really.
The truth is, to my mind, it hasn't. The sheriff didn't try it. I mean, the idea of actually encouraging and arming lashkars to take on the Taliban. It's very difficult for the army to do it, because in a lot of the places the Lashkars are saying, we'll do this, we'll take on the Taliban, but we don't want the army. So you stay out, we'll kick Taliban out, leave us alone.
But so which Taliban? The point is, you know, if you look at South Waziristan today, we know that Baitullah Masood is bad Taliban. But is Jalaluddin Haqqani bad Taliban? Is Maulvi Nazir bad? I mean, you know, the army has a very clear idea of the good and the bad Taliban, and it doesn't always resonate in the same way, either with local Lashkars or indeed with the United States and the international community. So, you know, when we talk about arming groups to take on the Taliban, you know, we need to know what we're talking about here. And it seems to me that, you know, we're not.
Yeah, I'm with Victoria on this, and I'm not convinced by your description of this as a civil war. There are pockets of people, you know, intending to try and bring down the state and run their patch of ground, but that's not the same as an organised civil war. One part of the country passionately and ideologically as a point of identity trying to break away from the rest. I don't think that makes it much of an easier problem, and I just don't think it is a...
My understanding is they're not trying to break away from the rest, they're trying to take over the rest.
Well,
These are, you know, madrasa-trained armies, the new Pakistani Taliban, who are trying to move down into Punjab, and once they've begun to move from the northwest frontier, that's when the real threat to Pakistani the integrity of the state began.
Well, I would like to make the point, David, that I think, yes, it's threatening, so to speak, the integrity of the state, but we've got to look at the numbers here. The majority of Pakistanis are Punjabis, and they live in and around Punjab, and you're talking about 66% of the population, 2/3 of the population are Punjabi. And so this idea of a takeover, of an ideological takeover, firstly you've got to get over the sort of tribal ethnic divide between these Pashtuns, essentially, who are the Taliban, infecting the Punjabis with their brand of jihadism. And I think that's unlikely. Of course, the numbers, when you're talking about a population of 160 million, they're still significant, and even a few people can do a tremendous amount of damage. And I think what we're more likely to be seeing is these random attacks here in Lahore or in Karachi, or again in Peshawar we've just had. But I think this
well, the people who carried out, the men who carried out the Mumbai attacks were Punjabi and Kashmiri.
Yeah, no, and there's a problem with the south of Punjab.
Yes.
It's been boiling up, but still, I think Victoria's right to put it in perspective. You think how recent these city bombings have been. In Pakistani cities, incredibly vulnerable, and yet it's the past year and a half, 2 years, that this has really become a phenomenon. I mean, I know where you're coming from, and you spend your life with these people, deeply unpleasant people, and talking to other people who've been blown up by the deeply unpleasant people. But you know, a lot of Pakistan does.
It does exist.
Punjab is a very kind of good country.
Yeah, can I also say that
some other bits.
Just sort of add to what the two of you are saying. I mean, this idea of the great Pashtun hordes coming down towards the Punjab. I mean, and radicalizing this, you know, this heartland. Again, is to me rather strange. I mean, when you think of it, you know, the great jihadi outfits in Pakistan, whether it's Lashkar-e-Taiba, whether it's Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, whether it's Jaish-e-Mohammed, they're all headquartered in the Punjab. So, you know, I mean, we're not talking here about hordes coming to radicalize these areas. They're already there, and they have been in this region now for at least 2 decades. So, you know, that process has been going on. It's just that we've only woken up to it now.
Well, that seems to be a problem. And, you know, these groups are strong. They're extremely well financed. They're deep into Punjabi society. These social controls have started already in Punjabi cities. The DVD stalls are being threatened, the barbers are being threatened, the juice bars are being closed down, the sort of things that happened in northwest Pakistan 4 or 5 years ago, they're beginning to happen. You know, the question now is whether with the Taliban, you know, I understood they're a very confusing movement, there are lots of different elements to it, but whether they're sufficiently on the back foot to give up on this campaign to spread it to Punjab. If I were in their shoes, I'd certainly want to open up a Punjab front, and I think they'll try and do that. And I imagine it would start with police being beheaded in Punjabi cities and terrify the police into basically guarding buildings and guarding people. and then you've got a big problem, because that is the heartland. And I would have thought, from any Taliban commander's point of view, with any strategic vision, they have to do that. And it may be that they're just too much on the defensive to do it, but I'm sure they want to do it.
Well, that is a civil war.
Isn't it? Well,
it comes down to numbers. It isn't on my standard.
Well, there's no technical definition of a civil war. I want to bring in the audience because there's a lot of people here, faces I recognise, who know a lot about this region. Yes, sir. If you do represent an organisation or an embassy or a government or something, perhaps you could tell us who you are. If you're just a person, then by all means...
by all means, speak.
I can confirm I'm just a person.
Can we have your name, sir?
Name is Jamil Zubairi. I'm a bank director. What I would like the panel to say that for some reason, you all have chosen to ignore one fact. The violence was never there. It started because of foreign interference. Russians moved in, the Americans moved in, the West moved in, the Arabs moved in, 40,000 Arabs were trained, brought there, and they created that havoc. It was never there. I was in Kabul just before the Russians moved in. I never saw a girl covered. They were all in skirt. So I think this thing everybody's ignored it. Even till today, the interference is beyond belief. Mr. Zardari has been renditioned into Pakistan. He doesn't deserve to be there. Owen Benjo talked about a child suicide bomber. How horrible, we all agree with it. What about a child party chairman sitting in Oxford? What is all this going on? And we have a fascist party whose leader is running the setup from London. The entire secretariat is running. And nobody talks about it, which is creating our life hell living in that part of the world because directly affected by what's happening here. And I would like you to comment on this. This foreign interference should be positive, not negative.
Foreign interference.
Well, I think the problems...
Not a voter for the PPP, I imagine.
I think the problems for Pakistan has always been, and actually, Farzana, you make this point in your book, where Pakistan's actually not following its strategic interest. It gets caught up by following America's strategic interests, which are not in Pakistan's interests. And somehow, because of its fight with India over Kashmir, it's wanted to cozy up to America because it gives Pakistan greater clout. And I think this has been, we've seen it a thread ever since the 60s, ever since the Ayub time. Pakistan has felt, well, if it has America on board, somehow it'll have America's support over the Kashmir issue. But surprise, surprise, it hasn't. And certainly, I would agree. I think the problem with Pakistan, and the first time I went there was 31 years ago. Firstly, there were no drugs. There were no Kalashnikov rifles. You never had a chowkidar sitting outside your door with a Kalashnikov in case some undesirable came to kidnap you or kill you. The violence has come up absolutely since the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And this was one of the problems of putting the genie back in the bottle. Once you had all these arms floating around from the Afghan jihad, which the West supplied in their own wisdom in order to get the Soviets out of Afghanistan, but you've had the blowback because the arms were never picked up, never collected, and it really infected Pakistan society.
Bronwyn, I mean, you know, a new administration in the US seems a completely different colour to me. The way they talk about these regions, the way they no. I mean the atmosphere that wasn't a Freudian whatever. Watching them in the field. Yeah. When you watch the US administration in the field, the complete the atmosphere is totally different. I saw them at the Hague summit. Richard Holbrooke and Hillary Clinton listening hard to what Iranian diplomats were saying, meeting them in the corridor. I mean, is there a new way of looking at the region which might address our friends' view that Western, particularly US influence, has been pretty malign over the last 30 years with all those arms flooding about? Is there something different that's being offered now? Well,
it might. I think the tone of the Obama administration is very different, although Richard Holbrooke is no one's idea of mild diplomacy. But I have a problem with the question in that I sort of agree with you, stretching a point, that the violence has come up since the point of foreign intervention you describe. I don't accept that it's come up because of that. I think the foreign intervention came in, I mean, for different reasons. But I think you're making the kind of argument that it's happened since then, and so it's happened because of that. And I just don't, for 1,000 reasons.
No,
I don't accept that.
I'm not making that point. I'm saying that nothing has been done to stop it. Because the interference is not stopping, because arms are still flowing in.
Yeah. I'm going to move on from that, and certainly Voen thinks the Lashkars are going to be armed. Charles Allen.
Zia was not a Russian, I have to say, and he predates the Russians. And that, to me, is when the problem seemed to start. I'd like people to talk a little bit about Deobandism, if they could. Deobandism, essentially foreign, in the sense of being across the border, and opposed to Barelvi, all the local traditions which you talked about, which have been suffocated, I have to say, by mostly foreign money, but Saudi money. But nevertheless, education has not been talked about today, and it seems to me that somehow Pakistan, the governments of Pakistan, abandoned the idea of educating their people. It's an absolute, with tragic consequences.
Farzana, I mean, you want a new settlement without these arguments within Islam, but Deobandism and its influence that goes way back before the Russian period, really, in terms of its malign effect on Pakistan. This kind of ultra tough particular view of Islam.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to get into the arcane politics of sectarian Islam. I mean, we could, but I just want to pick up on
a
couple of
rather than arcane, actually. But yeah.
Just want to pick up on a couple of points. One is, of course, the whole question of violence, whether or not it is the consequence of foreign intervention. And I think, really, my own position on this is that Pakistan has been as much a victim as a perpetrator of violence, and I think we need squarely to face up to this. I mean, there is, a view shared by many historians of Pakistan who believe that Pakistan still harbors what some of us like to describe as a minority complex, harbors this sort of victim mentality, and it's really done the country no good. As far as its partnering with great powers is concerned, of course, I have argued in my book that Pakistan's precisely its lack of a coherent and well-formed sense of national self has driven it to seek validation by partnering with the great powers, particularly with the United States, again with extremely damaging consequences. As far as the Barelvi-Deobandi tension is concerned, yes, I mean, for those of you who are not so familiar with Pakistan, let me just say that the vast majority of Pakistanis subscribe to what are known as the Barelvi schools of Islam, a school of Islam that is generally seen to be much more centered around shrine worship, centered around holy men, otherwise known as peers, a much more tolerant form of Islam, it is said, as opposed to the Deobandi variety, which of course is closely connected to the Deoband school, an actual seminary established in India in the late 1860s, which subscribes to a much more literal and scripturalist reading of Islam. Now, I've tried to show in my book how over the years that Barelvi Islam, which was much more rooted in the regions, has been steadily eroded, partly under the pressure of several stages of state Islamization, which somehow saw these local varieties of Islam as being corrupted, as too vulnerable to so-called Hindu syncretistic influences.
But then latterly, at the huge quantities of Saudi money that are effectively funding
exactly
much of the only education that goes on in
that's
the
right,
Northwest Frontier in particular.
That's right. Whereas the more literal and scripturalist readings of Islam, with which Deobandi Islam is associated, was seen to be a much better expression, or a much closer expression, of the kind of modern state, modern Islamic state, that Pakistan was meant to be, particularly, of course, encouraged by General Zia's vision of what the modern Islamic State would look like. He had no time for these so-called local expressions of Islam, which he and many of Pakistan's modernist elite, I should say, have judged to be corrupted and quite at odds with the more legalistic variety of Islam espoused by Deobandi. Now, the fact that it became a very much more punitive form of Islam under General Zia-ul-Haq is, of course, something that, you know, as I said, we can explore in greater detail. But there's always been that tension, and today it comes as a great irony that the state in Pakistan, which for a long time had harbored nothing but contempt for local Sufi forms of Islam as being too corrupt, as being too rooted in the regions, as being too sort of bound up with questionable local, the questionable local nexus of power, should be espousing that same Sufi Islam as the only way to combat the Taliban threat. So we've sort of lurched from one to another, and you know and still, as I said, you know, stand in danger of losing our way.
You'll know that the new British government policy towards the region it puts far more money into Pakistan than it does into Afghanistan. Aid for Pakistan next year will be larger from this country than for Afghanistan. Most of it going into education. There's a real you know, total change of policy. And I was talking to a Pakistani official the other day, and he said, yes, we're very pleased to get this. It means we can spend more money on our troops.
Oh dear. Can I'd like...
Oh, sorry. I just say really quick, I think your point about education is absolutely right. We hear almost too much about madrasas because it takes away attention from just how dreadful the mainstream schools are and how nothing's been done about the curriculum. And Benazir, I think, was as guilty as all the others of that.
It was difficult. I mean, I think, again, if we just bring out that statistic, 50% of the population are considered to be educated, and only up to sort of high school standard, and that's 80 million uneducated people floating around there. I wanted to bring up the questioner's point about Zia. I think, in a way, Pakistan got a double dosage of misfortune with Zia, because firstly, you had the army coming in and effectively just putting political activity on hold for a period of 11 years. And secondly, you happen to have a man who, in his personal life, and it didn't appear until he took over, was this very orthodox Sunni Muslim who had a particular vision which he foisted onto Pakistan. And I think, Farzana, your book might not have had to have been written in a way if we hadn't have had a General Zia with his version of Islam. And he put it into this void, this political void which he'd created to try and make some sort of constituency. And I think that's what's really damaged Pakistan, and in a way to unscramble the situation is what is the biggest problem. And so I would certainly put that as one very down point.
There's a question right at the front.
My name is Raja Ansari. I'm a media coordinator for Sindh chapter of Muhammad Nawaz Sharif, the only popular leader of Pakistan.
The only proper or the only popular?
The only popular leader in Pakistan.
Fine.
My question is this.
Is that he has on his business
One
card,
theory,
the only popular leader in Pakistan.
With a head.
This is a fact. One theory is this, that unstable Pakistan is suitable for India and America. The people of Pakistan, several times they proved that they are not extremists, they are not religious, they are secular because they, if you look and the result of February 2008 election results, they elect in Frontier ANP, the secular political party. They elect PMLN in Punjab, secular party. They elect People's Party in Balochistan and Sindh and Punjab, secular party. They prove that they are not religious extremists. This is not a question of Islam, basically. We Pakistani, we believe that this is the question of our atom bomb. The West thinks that a Muslim country who has a atomic power, this is not in favor or in interest of West. You comment on that, is this theory is correct that unstable Pakistan is suitable for India and America? Thank you.
Instability suitable.
Owen, what about Owen? Owen.
Well, I think there are people in India who do not want to see a strong Pakistan, and I think that's been there as a body of thought since '47, and I'm sure it's still there. And I think when the Pakistanis claim that India is destabilizing Balochistan and doing various things they can to undermine Pakistan, it's probably true. I mean, maybe I don't have any evidence it is true, but I quite well believe it. So that strand of thought is definitely there in India. From the American point of view, I'd have thought it's quite clear if they're spending $12 billion since 9/11, that's serious money, and they are interested in a stable Pakistan. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And your idea that your party is secular, when Nawaz Sharif tried to introduce Sharia law in the late 90s, is rather confusing to me.
But it was the Sharia law with the cinemas and with all, you know, secular thoughts.
Cinemas. There's one in the middle here. Yeah. I'll take the next question from a woman. Yes, there's one back there. Yeah. But after this chap here, and then you.
Hello. Yes. David. Point of information. Devbandis, in the struggle for independent India, always opposed the idea of Pakistan. Dr. Shaikh will know that very clearly. They were never in favor of Pakistan. Now, the question that I put to you, particularly Dr. Farzana Shaikh, is this. Last February in Dhaka, we had a situation where the ordinary foot soldiers of Bangladesh Rifles strung up a 3-star general of the Bangladesh Army. Do you visualize, considering the widespread perception among the Pakistanis, that the Pakistan Army, what it is doing in South Waziristan, in Malakand, is fundamentally at the behest of America and under the threat that unless they do what they are doing, the aids which keeps them going will be stopped? Do you think there is any prospect of 1 or 2 of the high command people being strung up in one of the cantonments?
US aid conditional on destroying the Taliban, smashing the Taliban.
Well, I don't, at least I can't as yet visualize a situation where the chain of command and control in Pakistan's military establishment would break down to the point where we would find a 3-star general strung up. So that's my short answer. But as to whether or not Pakistan's army in particular keeps alive a conflict, keeps alive Pakistan's instability as a means of continuing to benefit from international, particularly US largesse, this I think is a serious question. And I don't think we have a ready answer to that yet. I think the cynical answer to that would be probably yes. I would not want to go down that way because I simply just don't have the evidence to substantiate that claim. But there is certainly a view now that Pakistan has come, or at least its military establishment, has come to understand that it can best negotiate with a gun held to its head, which means that if you don't give us what we want, we'll go under, but we'll also take you with us. And this has in turn, I think, fueled, or is in the process of fueling, what I would call a certain culture of entitlement to aid, which again is proving to be very, very damaging to Pakistan, the consequences of which I'm sure we will see in the years to come.
There's a question, there's a woman at the back here in the middle. Yes.
Yeah, great. My name is Sandra Kaduri. I'm a communications consultant. It was just a question about image and branding in a way. I just wonder what it is about the Taliban that continues to attract sort of some sympathy, what they actually represent to people that certain people that is attractive. Because obviously we see the Taliban, we see brutality, we don't see them representing true Islam, they don't represent their national interest, it's pure destruction. So is there something about the sort of jihad, there's still these romantic connotations about jihad that makes them attractive to certain elements of the society or to help them radicalize other people? Because I really still can't understand it.
Wow, I've never thought of the Taliban as a strong brand, but I guess it is one of the best, the world's best known.
No, well, I mean, I'm happy to just sort of pitch in here. I think it is a brand, actually, and it's attractive to a young, uneducated group of individuals who have been fed a sort of an anti-Americanism, an anti-Westernism that has really taken off in the last sort of 10, 20 years. And it presents almost a nationalist alternative. And this is what's accounting for a great deal of unpopularity with the current government. I mean, forget the fact it may not be the Muslim League, that's the PPP government. Any government that had a relationship with the United States would be subject to the same sort of unpopularity. And it's a very difficult catch-22 situation because America thinks that it's pouring in this money, which hopefully, if they have allocated so much for education, will actually find its way to build schools and train teachers. It's actually not so much the building of schools, it's the training of teachers. But so what do young boys do? They think they'll join the Taliban, and for many, I even know people who think, well, this is what we want to do. We want to go and join the Taliban and sort of kill some infidels.
Can I step down from the chair and try and answer? There's quite a lot about that in my book. I mean, I think there's a lot of difference between the Pakistani Taliban and the Afghan Taliban. And the Afghan Taliban emerged in the 1990s as a reaction to the criminality of the warlords. And they brought as really quite a revolutionary verve to a nationalist cause, and were actually quite popular across quite a lot of rural Afghanistan. Initially. Even into quite late in their rule, and certainly not in the cities, and certainly not in Kabul and Herat and then the northern cities where they were a sort of monstrous different kind of rule because they come from the Pashtun South and they brought this very singular view of Islam. But the Pakistani Taliban have emerged from somewhere else altogether. They've come since 2001 as a local response, uniting sort of local people who think that Al-Qaeda are cool. And they operate in a completely closed loop. They don't need the Western press. It's quite hard to work with them. They occasionally do the odd interviews, but they operate through DVDs and these bloodthirsty videos and speak to a poor, uneducated, we've heard a lot about education since Charles raised it in the last 10 minutes, group of people in the northwest frontier and in Punjab and in Kashmir who see Islam as being a faith which once dominated the world and is now small compared to America, and they want to have a go. And they're willing to, once jihad is declared and being a suicide bomber is a guarantee to martyrdom, then they go straight back to the roots of the soldiers who would Wahhabi warriors who in the 1897 war would go towards British lines firing their guns in the air to guarantee that they would die in battle. And these are the direct lineal and faith descendants of those characters. And they're very hard to combat because they have a much more internationalist view. And back onto Farzana's sort of, what is Pakistan? They have a very much an internationalist kind of view. They're not nationalists in the same way that the Afghan Taliban have used jihad as nationalism against a foreign invader. But I'll now go back into the chair. Farzana, you're writing things. And does anyone else have anything very much to say on that? Or
I don't disagree with what you've said, but I mean, surely the answer to this whole question of why it is that groups in Pakistan, almost everybody sort of, you see, the point about the Taliban, and I use this word with some caution because it isn't this monolithic entity, in fact. The Taliban, at least in Pakistan, is an extremely diverse phenomenon, driven for the most part by local grievances. And I think, you know, sort of describing them as sort of Taliban tends to give them a unity that they clearly do not, I think, enjoy, not yet at least. So they are driven by local grievances. But I think, you know, the point about many of these groups in Pakistan is that while to you, to me, and to others in Pakistan, they may not be acting in the name of Islam, the point is that they believe that they are acting in the name of Islam. And this is the real difficulty in Pakistan, again, which goes back to the uncertainty and the ambivalence that accompany the creation of the state, that this uncertainty has promoted certain forms of exclusionary discourses, whereby, you know, the whole question of which Islam translated or has tended to translate into proper ways of expressing that Islam, into proper ways of being a Muslim. The whole question of who is a good Muslim, a bad Muslim, has now sort of taken off in a way that seems uncontrollable and truly frightening for many of us in Pakistan. And that's really why there are many, including myself, who are calling for the state now to adopt a neutral stance, which no constitution to this point has enabled the state to do. I mean, Pakistan is today a country where the state religion is Islam. And I would suggest that really we need now to open this up for a fresh debate. It may not result in the consequences of my preference, but we need to have a new debate in Pakistan.
I have one.
May I just say something very quickly? I think it's an excellent point about how local a lot of these passions remain. I recall slightly from your use of the word brand, partly because it does seem to imply that they're homogeneous in a way that they're just not at the moment.
At the back.
Yeah, I think it's quite clear that Pakistan, pretty much since its inception, has been run either by secularists or kind of totalitarians, or just basically people who have really very little understanding of Islam, like the depth of Islam. And that's one thing. And then, therefore, policymakers and solution finders for a problem now, which is essentially veiled or termed in Islamic terminology, if you like, is problematic for me. Because if you have a secular mindset or a totalitarian mindset or whatever else has existed there, and you're trying to find solutions for essentially a faith-based mindset, which is what most Pakistanis ultimately have, I think that unless you involve a creative element within the scenario, when it comes to the education and finding the solutions, I think it's terribly important that the creatives are involved in this process. You leave it to bureaucrats, you leave it to local politicians, and ultimately it's just about the dollar. It's going to be about going and doing whatever the dollar does. And what they'll usually do is what usually happens in my village back in Jhelum, Talibanwala. You'll find that some funds will be allocated to build a road, and around about, initially it'll start off as about 100,000 rupees or something to build a stretch of road. And by the time it gets down to the actual building, it'll be about 4,000 allocated to it. Net result is a crap road. But in the same way, if all these billions are now being poured in after 80 billion, the admission of the US Embassy itself here in a meeting that I had with the War College was that $80 billion has been put into the industry of Talibanization, or kind of Islamicization generally, or fundamentalism, basically. So if America is now, and the West is perhaps now thinking of pouring another $80 billion into Pakistan,
are you moving towards something with a question mark?
To reverse the process, exactly. I just think that but the question would be, how do you generate a creative input into finding solutions for a faith-based society, given that most of the society that is in the policy-making sector is not faith-based?
Well, a constitution drawn up by artists, that would be wonderful. But what do you think?
Well, all this, of course, raises very tough questions, very pertinent questions. I'm not sure that, I mean, I think the situation now in Pakistan is so bad that what we've got into, in some sense, is a mood of defeatism. This sort of this sense of helplessness that, oh well, you know, we're all faith-based, and you know the only thing we can do is simply, you know, go with the flow. And what I'm suggesting is that this flow has been hugely disastrous for Pakistan, and it is of the utmost urgency to dam this flow. For example, if you take madrasa education, which has become a key policy issue, I mean, we have had any number of reports and policy planning units set up to look into the question of modernizing madrasas in Pakistan, with the view that, well, you know, somehow if we could lift these institutions, modernize them, all would be well. And I have repeatedly recommended, whenever I have been asked, that the madrasas should simply be allowed to suffer a state of benign neglect. What we need in Pakistan is to revitalize our public school education, which has fallen into total disrepair. The need of the moment is not to revitalize the madrasas, not to modernize the madrasas.
Owen.
Guys, let's just say a word about that. There is a policy proposal which was there when Musharraf was there, and he failed to do it, which was to build the best state schools right next to the most radical madrasas. And the education minister, former ISI chief, tried to push that, and was convinced that it was actually quite limited funds required. And as you say, it wasn't actually challenging the madrasas in any sort of bureaucratic way of trying to shut them down or close them down. It was simply offering competition. And most parents would, I'm sure, and the government was sure, and this education minister was sure, would go with the state school. And interestingly, Shahbaz Sharif has picked this up and is in Punjab, where he's now running Punjab. He's talking about putting boarding schools with the best facilities next to the most problematic madrasas. And we'll have to see whether he does it, but it's an extremely interesting idea, and I think would probably work, and would attract a lot of parents to send their children there rather than madrasas.
A woman at the front has been begging to get in, folks. Your hand has actually literally physically been up. It must be worn out.
No, sorry, it was 4 minutes. My name is Saswili Gari, and I'm a barrister by profession. Just a need to raise two points here. We have been talking here about the secular constitution. I really cannot understand how, in a society where the Islam is not only considered as a so-called faith, but it has the impact on our culture, on our traditions, on our lifestyle. In such sort of a society, how you can have so-called secular constitution where 98% people are actually Muslims, number one. And number two, when we are actually trying to make sense of Pakistan, I think it is also very important to take the political scenario into the account. And we have to understand that the democracy has actually never been given a chance to basically take roots into Pakistan due to the intervention of army, which has been heavily backed up by Washington. What I'm trying to say is basically we do have a constitution which gives right to the minority. We do have a constitution which actually represents the moderate Islam. It's just we never get a chance to interpret it. And that happens because of the lack of the democracy in our country. And in one or another way, I, at the very personal level, think that Washington is, to some extent, very much responsible for that. And I don't know what your views on that.
Can I use that, because I think we're winding up towards a moment when, on a warm night, we might close. Can I use that very well phrased sort of thought on secular democracy to sort of get a closing thought from all of the panel? I mean, perhaps from that end and to that end.
I think it was an excellent question, and I agree with you that a secular constitution, a thoroughly secular constitution, is a non-starter. So I disagree with you. It is how Pakistan defines itself as an Islamic republic. On the other hand, the kind of things that Pakistan has not properly sorted out in its constitution, and it did take a long time to get itself a constitution into the 70s, are kind of secular questions. Is it what powers does the president have compared to parliament? What powers does the army have compared and the courts compared to the other institutions of state? And those things, I think, other countries might be able to help with, but it's really something that Pakistan has to work out for itself. But they're not necessarily religious questions, though I don't think you will ever get, and probably shouldn't ever get, a politician from Pakistan saying he isn't or she isn't religious, because it's not going to
the sting in the tail of the question, and it's still all the fault of America. The sort of sense that
these are problems that go to the foundation of Pakistan, and questions that were never resolved about which powers all those different bits of the country have. Why is that America's?
I'm exactly trying to say that, in my view, it's not actually in Islam which is our problem. Islam has always been, targeted because it's an easy target. That's what I believe in. Our problem is basically the lack of democracy, the lack of justice. People have been attracted to the terrorism because of the lack of education, as you rightly pointed out, and because there's a lack of justice, no judiciary.
Victoria,
people are hungry for this. Islam is not.
All right, I think America's been too willing to back a dictator who could deliver order. There and elsewhere. I'll give you that, but I don't think that's the whole of Pakistan's problem.
I would say, just 2 or 3 points very quickly, that Pakistan has had a system, but the system's only as good as the people who operate it. It has had a constitution. It took a long time to get that constitution, but no sooner did it have a constitution than it had this military coup, which I do consider was a very big turning point in '77. I would blame the myopia of the United States and its allies in supporting General Zia so wholeheartedly during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan for the sole objective of getting the Soviets out of Afghanistan. In so doing, it jeopardized Pakistan's political growth. It put it on hold for that 11-year period. When it got started again, it was almost back to square one. And I think that's been very difficult. And I wanted to make a final point, really, actually, Farzana, picking up on your good Muslim, bad Muslim situation, which we have to remind ourselves. When Bhutto was executed, when he was condemned 31 years ago for being a Muslim in name only. And so it's been a sort of a trait of Pakistan's sort of way it treats Muslims is to do this good Muslim, bad Muslim. And I think it's an interesting point. But we have to remain optimistic that the caliber of people within Pakistan, because it will only be Pakistanis who put their country right, is such that with education, and here I could make a little advertisement for a school that is operating near the madrasas, deep down in Mian Valley, and it's trying to do exactly that, attract children to come to this school, and it's doing quite well in its area, that you'll get that kind of caliber of Pakistanis who will say enough's enough of just not really running our system properly. We've got to run it because we do have the tools to run the country properly.
Farzana, you don't need a new constitution. You need to use the one you've got better.
The current constitution is deeply mangled. But let me just say, let me start with the sting in the tail, the bit about the United States having destroyed Pakistan for its own purposes. Part of this is true, but part of it, I believe, is vastly exaggerated. Pakistan has been the beneficiary, I believe, of US largesse. Pakistan has learnt and now perfected the fine art of manipulation. Weak states know how to manipulate, and Pakistan is in that position. I think talking about whether or not Pakistan is able to get a secular constitution, on that I would say that what I'm trying to argue here is not so much the case for a secular constitution as such, of course that would be my preference, but for a fresh debate and for a constitution that allows the state to return to what I think a state should be, a neutral player, not partisan in the way that it has been in Pakistan. Finally, as concerns our current constitution, the 1973 constitution, it patently does not protect minorities. In fact, the most gross example of the way in which it violated the rights of a minority is, of course, by ordering the collective excommunication of the Ahmadi minority, who judged themselves to be Muslims, but were collectively excommunicated by a legislature which had no business to decide who and who was not a good Muslim, let alone a Muslim. So really, you know, we are talking about a constitution here that is far from one that can be seen to guarantee the equal rights of all Pakistan's citizens.
Owen.
Agree with quite a few of the points made. You know, the Washington, Moscow, Riyadh, Tehran, they've all played a role and they've all done bad things to Pakistan, no doubt. The solutions will have to come from within if they're going to come from anywhere. The Taliban, its appeal, and I fully take the point, it's extremely complicated, diverse, confusing, differentiated movement, no doubt about that, but there are, I think, common elements to it, and in most of it, it is a revolutionary movement. It's a social movement as well as a religious movement. It is a revolutionary movement against a corrupt elite at the national and local levels. And therefore it is strong. And it has appeal, and the fight's now on, and we'll see where it goes.
Owen Bennett-Jones, Farzana Shaikh will be here to sign copies of Making Sense of Pakistan, her book out here. Bronwyn Maddox and Victoria Schofield, and my Afghan book also, I might mention, available. If you're not yet a member, well, there can't be anyone in this room who's not bought it, surely. If you're not yet a member of the Frontline Club, you don't have to be a foreign correspondent to join. Membership forms available downstairs, and there is a new newspaper called Frontline with broadsheet, the only, apart from the Daily Telegraph, broadsheet of any quality in England, which started last week, and there are 4 editions a year, and it's a very, very small subscription to get it, and if you become a member, there's a huge discount on subscriptions for Frontline, so you can pick up copies of that. It's £3 available in the bar downstairs. It only remains for me to say thank you very much, all of you, for coming.